Hi, I'm Michael Hughes, and this is Contract Mastery. Paragraph 17 of the lease agreement talks about property maintenance. This is one of the more extensive paragraphs in the lease agreement, and it has to do in large part with the tenant's obligations to maintain the property. And many tenants are surprised to learn that they have some fairly extensive obligations to maintain the rental property. It doesn't just fall to the landlord, because the tenant is going to be possessing the property for an extended period of time. They agree in the lease agreement to some fairly extensive maintenance obligations. Let's take a look at some of these. 17A, tenant's general responsibilities. The tenant, at the tenant's expense, must do all of these things. These are tenant obligations, and the tenant is required to pay for them. They cannot pass these items on to the landlord as maintenance requests. So 1, keep the property clean and sanitary. Promptly dispose of all garbage in appropriate receptacles. They can't just let the garbage pile up inside or outside of the rental property. They have to get rid of it. Supply and change heating and air conditioning filters per manufacturer's instructions. This is a pretty important one. And I have seen instances where long-term tenants have failed to change the heating and air conditioning filters. That has resulted in some damage to the HVAC system, and the tenant ended up having to pay for the repairs to the HVAC system. So according to manufacturer's instructions, tenants have to purchase the filters and tenants have to make sure they get changed. Number 4, supply and replace all light bulbs, fluorescent tubes, and batteries for smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, garage door openers, ceiling fan remotes, and other similar devices. The replacements have to be of the same type and quality that are in the property on the commencement date. Burned out light bulbs, oddly enough, tend to be a source of a lot of disputes between landlord and tenant. The requirement in 17A4 is for the tenant to supply and replace all light bulbs, fluorescent tubes, etc. That generally means even if the light bulb is burned out when the tenant takes the property, they are required to supply and replace all the light bulbs. So I've seen this provision generate some pretty heated disputes between landlord and tenant, especially after the tenant moves out and the tenant charges the security deposit to replace all the burned out light bulbs in the rental property. So it's important for the tenants to understand maintaining the light bulbs and batteries and smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, garage door openers, other kinds of remote devices. That is a tenant's obligation. If there is a water softener associated with the property, then the tenant is required to maintain appropriate levels of necessary chemicals or other matter in any water softener. So if it's a water softener that requires salt to be added into it or something like that, then it's the tenant's responsibility to maintain the required levels of those chemicals. You can't just let it go and thereby cause damage to that equipment. If you do, as a tenant, it's possible you'll end up having to pay for the repairs. Take action to promptly eliminate any dangerous condition on the property. That's a pretty broad term, but what we're talking about here is taking some sort of immediate action to prevent or alleviate any harm or further harm or damage to the property. If it's something that is going to require repairs to the property, then we're going to have to put in a request for repairs under paragraph 18. But what we're talking about here, generally speaking, are immediate type actions to remedy a dangerous condition that exists on the properties, to mitigate damage and harm. Number 7, take all necessary precautions to prevent broken water pipes due to freezing or other causes. When the temperatures drop below freezing, the tenants are obligated to do things like drip the water faucets, open up the cabinet doors so that warm air can circulate in and around the pipes, things like that. They have to take action. All necessary precautions is what it says to prevent broken water pipes due to freezing or other causes. If any of the keys to the property get lost or misplaced, the tenants are required to replace them. The tenants are required to pay any periodic, preventative, or additional extermination costs that may be desired by the tenant, and this would include treatment for bed bugs unless otherwise required by law. So, if the tenants want the property to be exterminated for insects, that is their obligation, either on a preventative or on a periodic or corrective basis. Extermination costs are borne by the tenant, unless the landlord agrees otherwise in the lease agreement. Number 10, remove any standing water on the property. The tenant is required to know the location and operation of the main water cutoff valve to the property and all electric breakers, and how to switch the valve or the breakers off at appropriate times to mitigate any potential damage. This would be very handy to get some cooperation from the landlord on this, of course, but even without that cooperation, it is the tenant's obligation under the lease to know the location of the cutoff valve and the breaker box and how to operate these items. One thing to bear in mind also is there are certain pieces of equipment that may have local breakers closer to the equipment. They may not have all of the breakers contained in a centralized breaker box. Number 12, water the foundation of the property at reasonable and appropriate times. When we are experiencing extreme drought conditions, really hot weather, hasn't rained forever, the reason that we need to water the foundation is as the ground dries up, it many times will pull away from the foundation. And part of the foundation's support structure, support mechanism, is all of the dirt all around it holding it in place. And when the ground dries out and pulls away from the foundation, you can get uneven stressing and you can get cracks in the foundation slab. To mitigate this, during those periods of really extreme drought, one thing that can be done is to take a water hose or a soaker hose or something like that and run it around the foundation and keep the ground that is next to the foundation, if not wet, then at least prevent it from drying and pulling away from the foundation. The tenant is required to supply and change water filtration systems, including but not limited to refrigerator water filters. So if there are filters, water filters, associated with the property, either, let's say, an under the kitchen sink kind of filtration system. Sometimes properties have filtering systems that are located in the garage. And many times, if the refrigerator has a ice maker or a built-in water dispenser, then there's going to be a water filter associated with the refrigerator, either built into the refrigerator itself or attached to the water line leading to the refrigerator. The tenants are required to replace those water filters as necessary. And then number 14 here, the tenant is obligated to promptly notify the landlord in writing of all needed repairs. The important thing here is to promptly notify the landlord when a repair is necessary. The tenant cannot just let it sit, and in doing that and letting the repair just sit and fester, that the situation gets worse. And so the repair that might have been relatively minor at the outset now grows into this big, involved, expensive repair just because the tenant did not notify the landlord of the situation. If that happens, then the landlord, under this paragraph 17A14, can hold the tenant responsible for the additional costs that were only incurred because the tenant did not promptly report the problem. 17B talks about maintenance of the yard maintenance. Who is going to do it, and what do we mean? What is the yard? Well, they give us a definition in 17B1. The yard means all lawns, shrubbery, bushes, flowers, gardens, trees, rock or other landscaping, and other foliage that is on or encroaching on the property or on any easement that is appurtenant to the property or connected to the property. It does not include common areas that are maintained by owners association, but when it comes to the yard, the definition, it's pretty extensive. It's a lot more than just mowing the grass. It includes shrubs, bushes, flowers, gardens, trees, any kind of rock or other landscaping. All of that has to be maintained as part of the yard. So now that we have a definition of what the yard is, what do we mean by maintain the yard? And so they give us a definition of that. 17B2, to maintain the yard means to perform activities such as, but not limited to, mowing, fertilizing, and trimming the yard, controlling pests and weeds in the yard, and removing debris from the yard. All of these things are included in the lease's definition of what it is to maintain the yard. Number 3, unless prohibited by city ordinance or some other law, the tenant will water the yard at reasonable and appropriate times, including but not limited to the following times. It's the tenant's obligation to water the yard. If they don't do that, and if the yard dies, the tenant can be held responsible for the costs of doing things like replacing shrubs, replacing bushes, resodding the entire lawn if all of the grass dies because the tenant did not water it. The parties here can set specific times when the tenant has to water the lawn. And I've seen parties do that. I've seen landlords and tenants just leave this blank, and then they lean on the tenant will water the yard at reasonable and appropriate times, etc. Another thing that I've seen fairly common is just a statement that the tenant will water the lawn sufficient to maintain the yard in a healthy condition. And then sometimes they'll also say, subject to watering restrictions. When we get into drought conditions, then the city might impose some watering restrictions. The tenant cannot be forced by the lease agreement, to violate water restrictions. And that's why it says, unless prohibited by ordinance or other law. But it's important for the tenants to understand it is their obligation to water the yard. The lease goes on to say, other than watering, which is always the tenant's obligation, other than watering, the yard will be maintained as follows. And then we get some check boxes to decide how the yard is maintained. Either the landlord will maintain the yard at their own expense. Maybe the landlord is going to send their lawn contractor or their yard contractor, their groundskeeper out to maintain the yard. In that case, the tenant will permit the landlord and the landlord's contractors reasonable access to the yard, and they will remove any pet from the yard at appropriate times. So if the landlord is going to send their landscapers out to maintain the yard, then the tenant has to allow them access, and they have to bring in any pets so that the landscapers can get on the yard and do their work. Option number 2, the tenant will maintain the yard at the tenant's own expense. And remember what we said, maintaining the yard includes mowing, fertilizing, trimming, controlling pests, controlling weeds, and removing debris. That is maintaining the yard. So under this selection, the tenant will do all of that at their own expense. The third option here says the tenant will maintain in effect a scheduled yard maintenance contract with either a contractor who regularly provides such service, which the tenant can select, or the second checkbox, the parties can name a specific yard maintenance contractor who will maintain the yard. So, for example, maybe the landlord wants the yard maintained by a very specific landscaper, but it's going to be the tenant's obligation to pay that landscaper. So here we would select 17B3C. The tenant is going to maintain, in effect, a scheduled yard maintenance contract with, and then the parties would check the second box and they'd write in the name of the landlord's preferred yard maintenance contractor. So 3 choices on how the yard will be maintained other than watering. The tenant is always responsible to water the lawn at reasonable and appropriate times. When it comes to maintenance of pools and spas that might be on the property, we don't talk about that in the body of the lease agreement. There is a pool/spa maintenance addendum that is a promulgated form that the parties will use if there is a swimming pool or a spa or hot tub on the property. 17D talks about prohibitions. These are things that the tenant cannot do when it comes to maintaining the property. Fairly extensive list. If the tenant installs any fixtures on the property, whether authorized or unauthorized, those fixtures will become the property of the landlord. If any fixtures are installed on the property during the lease, those fixtures become part of the property and therefore the landlord's property. Some examples of these: additional smoke alarms, additional carbon monoxide detectors, locks, alarm systems, cables, satellite dishes, other fixtures. If these get installed, they become property of the landlord. Except as otherwise permitted by law or this lease or in some other writing by the landlord, the tenant may not do any of these things. They may not remove any part of the property or any of landlord's personal property from the rental property. If the landlord leaves any of their own property on the rental property, the tenant has to leave that property in place. I have seen instances where the landlord has sort of cordoned off a little piece of the garage and they are leaving some of their personal property in that space. And the tenants are required to respect that, and they cannot remove the landlord's property. The tenant may not remove, change, add, or rekey any lock on the property. The keys that they are given must work on the property, but they cannot change the locks. If they do that, they have to get the landlord's advanced approval, and they also have to give a key to the landlord. The landlord is required to be able to access the property in accordance with the lease. The tenant may not make holes in the woodwork, the floors, or the walls, except that a reasonable number of small nails may be used to hang pictures in sheetrock and in the grooves in wood paneling. Small nails used to hang pictures or artwork. The mounts used to mount a flat screen TV to the wall are not small nails, and they are not included in this exception to making holes in the woodwork, the floors, or the walls. If the tenant chooses to mount a television to the wall in the rental property, then that is going to be damage that's going to have to be addressed at the end of the property, or the end of the lease, rather, excuse me. The tenant may not permit any water furniture on the property. No water beds, no fish aquariums that would be considered furniture. Fish are going to fall under the prohibition against any animals on the property. But even if the landlord allows the tenants to keep fish on the property, there's still this extra prohibition against water furniture. So obviously it applies to water beds, can't have any of those on the property, but it would also apply to things like large fish aquariums. No contained bodies of a lot of water on the rental property. The tenant cannot install additional phone or video cables, outlets, antennas, satellite receivers, or alarm systems. The tenant may not alter, replace, or remove flooring material, paint, or wallpaper in the property. Without the landlord's advance consent, the tenants cannot paint, cannot alter the color of the walls, cannot do anything to wallpaper, cannot alter, replace, or remove flooring. The tenant may not install, change, or remove any fixture, appliance, or non-real property item that is listed in paragraph 2 of the lease agreement under our definition of property. So let's say, for example, that included in the rental property was a refrigerator as a non-realty item. The tenant would not be permitted to remove that refrigerator from the property unless they got written approval from the landlord. The tenant may not keep or permit any hazardous material on the property, such as flammable or explosive materials. The tenant cannot keep or permit any material or item which causes any liability or fire and extended insurance coverage to be suspended or canceled, or for any of the premiums for those items to be increased. Cannot keep things on the property that would cause a liability hazard or a fire hazard or anything that might interfere or increase the cost of the landlord's insurance coverage. The tenant may not dispose of any environmentally detrimental substance on the property. Motor oil and radiator fluid are primary culprits here. There's already a prohibition against doing any sort of repair work on vehicles on the property. And now also we're going to tell the tenant, you can't pour out motor oil in the yard of the property. Can't dispose of any environmentally detrimental substance, motor oil, antifreeze, things like that. The tenant cannot allow or cause any lien to be filed against any portion of the property. Let's say that the tenant even gets authority to have some work done on the property by a contractor, and then the tenant fails to pay the contractor, and the contractor turns around and files a materialman's lien against the property. That is prohibited here under the terms of the lease. The tenant cannot cause or allow any lien to be filed against any part of the property. And the tenant cannot disconnect or intentionally damage any carbon monoxide detector or otherwise violate any local ordinance that requires a carbon monoxide detector on the property. 17E discusses what happens if the tenant fails to satisfy their obligations under paragraph 17. If the tenant fails to comply with this paragraph 17 or any pool or spa maintenance addendum, then in addition to exercising landlord's remedies under paragraph 27, which is the default paragraph of the lease agreement, the landlord may perform whatever action the tenant was supposed to do, and the tenant must immediately reimburse the landlord the reasonable expenses that landlord incurs, plus any administrative fees assessed by landlord's agents or any other entity as provided by law. So if the tenant fails to maintain the property in accordance with paragraph 17, if they fail to do what they promised to do under paragraph 17, then the landlord can take whatever action the tenant was supposed to do and then make the tenant reimburse them for those costs. That is over and above the landlord's rights under paragraph 27, which is the default paragraph. 17F talks about smoking and vaping. Smoking, including vaping or tobacco pipes of any type by either the tenant or the tenant's guests, family, or occupants, is either permitted or not permitted on the property. And if we're talking about smoking, vaping, anything like that on the property, bear in mind that the property includes the garage and the outdoor areas of the property. If the parties here select that smoking is not permitted on the property, that means it is not permitted anywhere within the outer boundary of the property. It includes inside the rental dwelling, it includes the garage, whether the door is open or closed, and it includes any outdoor area on the property. The no smoking prohibition means nowhere on the property.